Section 6, Part 1 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 6, Introduction Part 4, Norse Popular Tales, Part 1. The preceding observations will have given a sufficient account of the mythology of the Norsemen, and of the way in which it fell. They came from the East, and brought that common stock of tradition with them. Settled in the Scandinavian peninsula, they developed themselves through heathenism, Romanism, and Lutheranism, in a locality little exposed to foreign influence, so that even now the Dale man in Norway or Sweden may be reckoned among the most primitive examples left of peasant life. We should expect, then, that these popular tales, which, for the sake of those ignorant in such matters, it may be remarked, had never been collected or reduced to writing till within the last few years, would present a faithful picture of the national consciousness, or perhaps, to speak more correctly, that half-consciousness out of which the heart of any people speaks in its abundance. Besides those old-world affinities and primeval parallelisms, besides those dreamy recollections of its old home in the East, which we have already pointed out, we should expect to find its later history, after the Great Migration, still more distinctly reflected; to discover heathen gods masked in the garb of Christian saints, and thus to see a proof of our assertion above, that a nation more easily changes the form than the essence of its faith, and clings with a toughness which endures for centuries to what it has once learned to believe. In all mythologies, the trait of all others which most commonly occurs, is that of the descent of the gods to earth, where in human form they mix among mortals, and occupy themselves with their affairs, either out of a spirit of adventure, or to try the hearts of men. Such a conception is shocking to the Christian notion of the omnipotence and omnipresence of God, but we question if there be not times when the most pious and perfect Christian may not find comfort and relief from a fallacy which was a matter of faith in less enlightened creeds, and over which the Apostle, writing to the Hebrews, throws the sanction of his authority, so far as angels are concerned. Hebrews 13:1, Let brotherly love continue, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Nor could he have forgotten those words of the men of Lystra, The gods come down to us in the likeness of men; and how they called Barnabas Jupiter, and himself Mercury, because he was the chief speaker. Classical mythology is full of such stories. These wanderings of the gods are mentioned in the Odyssey, and the sanctity of the rites of hospitality and the dread of turning a stranger from the door took its origin from a fear lest the wayfaring man should be a divinity in disguise. According to the Greek story, Orion owed his birth to the fact that the childless Hyrieus, his reputed father, had once received unawares Zeus, Poseidon, and Hermes, or to call them by their Latin names, Jupiter, Neptune, and Mercury. In the beautiful story of Philemon and Baucis, Jupiter and Mercury reward the aged couple who had so hospitably received them by warning them of the approaching deluge. The fables of Phaedrus and Aesop represent Mercury and Demeter as wandering and enjoying the hospitality of men. In India it is Brahma and Vishnu who generally wander. In the Edda, Odin, Loki, and Honir thus roam about, or Thor, Thialfi, and Loki. Sometimes Odin appears alone as a horseman, who turns in at night to the smith's house, and gets him to shoe his horse, a legend which reminds us at once of the master smith. Sometimes it is Thor with his great hammer who wanders thus alone. Now let us turn from heathenism to Christian times, and look at some of these old legends of wandering gods in a new dress. Throughout the Middle Age, it is our blessed Lord and St. Peter that thus wander, and here we see that half-digested heathenism to which we have alluded. Those who may be shocked at such tales in this collection as the Master Smith and Gertrude's Bird, must just remember that these are most purely heathen traditions, in which the names alone are Christian; and if it be any consolation to any to know the fact, we may as well state at once that this adaptation of new names to old beliefs is not peculiar to the Norsemen, but is found in all the popular tales of Europe. Germany was full of them, and there St. Peter often appears in a snappish, ludicrous guise, which reminds the reader versed in Norse mythology of the tricks and pranks of the shifty Loki. In the Norse tales he thoroughly preserves his saintly character. Nor was it only gods that walked among men. In the Norse mythology, Frigga, Odin's wife, who knew beforehand all that was to happen, and Freyja, the goddess of love and plenty, were prominent figures, and often trod the earth. The three Norns or Fates, who sway the weirds of men, and spin their destinies at Mimir's well of knowledge, were awful venerable powers, to whom the heathen world looked up with love and adoration and awe. To that love and adoration and awe, throughout the Middle Age, one woman, transfigured into a divine shape, succeeded by a sort of natural right, and round the Virgin Mary's blessed head a halo of lovely tales of divine help beams with soft radiance as a crown bequeathed to her by the ancient goddesses. She appears as divine mother, spinner, and helpful virgin, Virge Sacrable. Flowers and plants bear her name. In England one of our commonest and prettiest insects is still called after her, but which belonged to Freyja, the heathen lady, long before the western nations had learned to adore the name of the mother of Jesus. [Footnote: So also Orion's belt was called by the Norsemen, Frigga's spindle or rock Friggjar rock. In modern Swedish, Friggarock, where the old goddess holds her own; but in Danish, Mariarock, Our Lady's rock or spindle. Thus, too, Carlavang, the car of men, or heroes, who rode with Odin, which we call Charles Wain, thus keeping something at least of the old name, though none of its meaning, became in Scotland Peter's Pleugh, from the Christian saint, just as Orion's sword became Peter's staff. But what do Lady Landers and Lady Ellison mean, as applied to the ladybird in Scotland? The reader of these tales will meet, in that of "The Lassie and her Godmother", No. 27, with the Virgin Mary in a purely mythic character, as the majestic guardian of sun, moon, and stars, combined with that of a helpful kindly woman, who, while she knows how to punish a fault, knows also how to reconcile and forgive. The Norseman's god was a god of battles, and victory his greatest gift to men. But this was not the only aspect under which the great father was revered. Not victory in the fight alone, but every other good gift came down from him and from the Aesir. Odin's supreme will was that treasure house of bounty towards which, in one shape or the other, all mortal desires turned, and out of its abundance showers of mercy and streams of divine favor constantly poured down to refresh the weary race of men. All these blessings and mercies, nay, their very source itself, the ancient language bound up in a single word, which, however expressive it may still be, has lost much of the fullness of its meaning in its descent to these later times. This word was "wish", which originally meant the perfect ideal, the actual fruition of all joy and desire, and not, as now, the empty longing for the object of our desires. From this original abstract meaning, it is but a step to pass to the concrete, to personify the idea, to make it an immortal essence, an attribute of the divinity, another name for the greatest of all gods himself; and so we find a host of passages in early writers, D.M., p. 126 and following, where they are cited at length, in every one of which God or Odin might be substituted for wish with perfect propriety. Here we read how the wish has hands, feet, power, sight, toil, and art; how he works and labors, shapes and masters, inclines his ear, thinks, swears, curses, and rejoices, adopts children, and takes men into his house; behaves, in short, as a being of boundless power and infinite free will. Still more, he rejoices in his own works as in a child, and thus appears in a thoroughly patriarchal point of view, as the lord of creation, glorifying in his handiwork, as the father of a family in early times was glad at heart when he reckoned his children as arrows in his quiver, and beheld his house full of a long line of retainers and dependents. For this attribute of the great father, for Odin as the god of wish, the Edda uses the word oski, which literally expresses the masculine personification of wish, and it passed on and added the works wish, as a prefix to a number of others, to signify that they stood in a peculiar relation to that great giver of all good. Thus we have Oska Stein, or wishing stone, i.e., a stone which plays the part of a divining rod, and reveals secrets and hidden treasure; Oska Byr, a fair wind, a wind as fair as man's heart could wish it; Oskbarn and Oskabarn, a child after one's heart, an adopted child, as when the younger Edda tells us that all those who die in battle are Odin's choice bairns, his adopted children, those on whom he has set his heart, an expression which, in their turn, was taken by the Icelandic Christian writers to express the relation existing between God and the baptized; and, though last, not least, Oska Mare, Wish Maidens, another name for the Valkyries, Odin's course choosers, who picked out the dead for him on the field of battle, and waited on the heroes of Valhalla. Again, the Edda is filled with choice things, possessing some mysterious power of their own, some virtue, as our older English would express it, which belong to this or that god, and are occasionally lent or lost. Thus Odin himself had a spear which gave victory to those on whose side it was hurled, Thor a hammer which destroyed the giants, hallowed vows, and returned of itself to his hand. He had a strength belt too, which, when he girded it on, his god strength waxed one half. Freyr had a sword which wielded itself; Freyja a necklace which, like the cestus of Venice, inspired all hearts with love. Freyr, again, had a ship called Skithblathnir. She is so great that all the Aesir, with their weapons and war gear, may find room on board her; and as soon as the sail is set, she has a fair wind whither she shall go; and when there is no need for faring on the sea in her, she is made of so many things, and with so much craft, that Freyr may hold her together like a cloth, and keep her in his bag. Snorro's Edda, Stockholm, 1842, translated by the writer. Of this kind, too, was the ring Dropper which Odin had, and from which 12 other rings dropped every night; the apples which Idun, one of the goddesses, had, and of which, so soon as the Aesir ate, they became young again; the helm which Ogier the sea giant had, which struck terror into all antagonists, like the Aegis of Athene; and that wonderful mill which the mythical Frodi owned, of which we shall shortly speak. Now let us see what traces of this great god Wish and his choice bairns and wishing things we can find in these tales, faint echoes of a mighty heathen voice, which once proclaimed the goodness of the Great Father in the blessings which he bestowed on his chosen sons. We shall not have long to seek. In the tale No. 20, when Shortshanks meets those 3 old crook-backed hags, who have only one eye, which he snaps up, and gets first a sword that puts a whole army to flight, be it ever so great, we have the one-eyed Odin degenerated into an old hag, or rather, by no uncommon process, we have an old witch fused by a popular tradition into a mixture of Odin and the 3 Nornir. Again, when he gets that wondrous ship, which can sail over fresh water and salt water, and over high hills and deep dales, and which is so small that he can put it into his pocket, and yet, when he came to use it, could hold 500 men, we have plainly the Skithblathnir of the Edda to the very life. So also in the Best Wish, No. 36, the whole groundwork of this story rests on this old belief, and when we meet that pair of old scissors that cuts all manner of fine clothes out of the air, that tablecloth which covers itself with the best dishes you could think of, as soon as it was spread out, and that tap which, as soon as it was turned, poured out the best of mead and wine, we have plainly another form of Frodi's wishing quern, another recollection of these things of choice about which the old mythology has so much to tell. Of the same kind are the tablecloth, the ram, and the stick in the Lad Who Went to the North Wind, No. 34, and the rings in the 3 Princesses of Whiteland, No. 26, and the Soraya Maria Castle, No. 56. In the first of these stories, too, we find those 3 brothers who have stood on a moor these 100 years fighting about a hat, a cloak, and a pair of boots, which had the virtue of making him who wore them invisible; choice things which will again remind the reader of the Nibelungen Lied, of the way in which Siegfried became possessed of the famous hoard of gold, and how he got that cap of darkness which was so useful to him in his remaining exploits. So again in the Blue Belt, No. 22, what is that belt which, when the boy girded it on, he felt as strong as if he could lift the whole hill, but Thor's choice belt? And what is the daring boy himself, who overcomes the Troll, but Thor himself, as engaged in one of his adventures with the giants? So, too, in Little Annie the Goose Girl, No. 59, the stone which tells the prince all the secrets of his brides is plainly the old Oskastein, or wishing stone. These instances will suffice to show the prolonged faith in Wish, and his choice things; a belief which, though so deeply rooted in the North, we have already traced to its home in the East, whence it stretches itself from pole to pole, and reappears in every race. We recognize in it the wishing cap of Fortunatus, which is a Celtic legend; in the cornucopia of the Romans; in the great Amalthea among the Greeks; in the wishing cow and wishing tree of the Hindus, in the pumpkin tree of the West Indian Anansi stories, in the cow of the Servian legends, who spins out yarn out of her ear, in the Sampo of the Finns, and in all these stories of cups and glasses and horns and rings and swords, seized by some bold spirit in the midst of a fairy revel, or earned by some kind deed rendered by mortal hand to one of the good folk in her hour of need, and with which the luck (see the well known story of "The Luck of Eden Hall") of that mortal's house was ever afterwards bound up, stories with which the local traditions of all lands are full, but which all pay unconscious homage to the worship of that great God, of whom so many heathen hearts so often turned as the divine realizer of their prayers and the giver of all good things, until they came at last to make an idol out of their hopes and prayers, and to immortalize the very wish itself. Again, of all beliefs that in which man has, at all times of his history, been most prone to set faith, is that of a golden age of peace and plenty, which had passed away, but which might be expected to return. Such a period was looked for when Augustus closed the temple of Janus, and peace, though perhaps not plenty, reigned over what the proud Roman called the habitable world. Such a period the early Christian expected when the Saviour was born, in the reign of that very Augustus; and such a period some, whose thoughts were more set on earth than heaven, have hoped for ever since, with a hope which, though deferred for 18 centuries, has not made their hearts sick. Such a period of peace and plenty, such a golden time, the Norseman could tell of in his mythic Frodi's reign, when gold, or Frodi's meal as it was called, was so plentiful that golden armlets lay untouched from year's end to year's end on the king's highway, and the fields bore crops unsown. Here in England, the Anglo-Saxon Bede, History 2:16, knew how to tell the same story of Edwin, the Northumbrian king, and when Alfred came to be mythic, the same legend was passed on from Edwin to the West Saxon monarch. The remembrance of the bountiful Frodi echoed in the songs of German poets long after the story which made him so bountiful had been forgotten; but the Norse skalds could tell not only the story of Frodi's wealth and bounty, but also of his downfall and ruin. In Frodi's house were 2 maidens of that old giant race, Fenja and Menja. These daughters of the giant he had bought as slaves, and he made them grind his quern or hand mill, Gradi, out of which he used to grind peace and gold. Even in that golden age one sees there were slaves, and Frodi, however bountiful to his thanes and people, was a hard taskmaster to his giant handmaidens. He kept them to the mill, nor gave them longer rest than the cuckoo's note lasted, or they could sing a song. But that quern was such that it ground anything that the grinder chose, though until then it had ground nothing but gold and peace. So the maidens ground, and one sang their piteous tale in a strain worthy of Aeschylus, as the other worked. They prayed for rest and pity, but Frodi was deaf. Then they turned in giant mood, and ground no longer peace and plenty, but fire and war. Then the quern went fast and furious, and that very night came Mysing, the sea rover, and slew Frodi and all his men, and carried off the quern; and so Frodi's peace ended. The maidens the sea rover took with him, and when he got on the high seas he bade them grind salt. So they ground; and at midnight they asked if he had not salt enough, but he bade them still grind on. So they ground till the ship was full, and sank, Mysing, maids, and mill and all, and that's why the sea is salt. Perhaps of all the tales in this volume, none could be selected as better proving the toughness of the traditional belief than No. 2, which tells why the sea is salt. The notion of the arch-enemy of God and man, or a fallen angel, to whom power was permitted at certain times for an all-wise purpose by the great ruler of the universe, was as foreign to the heathendom of our ancestors as his name was outlandish and strange to their tongue. This notion Christianity brought with it from the East, and though it is a plant which has struck deep roots, grown distorted and awry, and borne a bitter crop of superstition, it required all the authority of the Church to prepare the soil at first for its reception. To the notion of good necessarily follows that of evil. The Eastern mind, with its Ormuzd and Ahriman, is full of such dualism; and from that hour, when a more than mortal eye saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven, St. Luke 10:18, the kingdom of darkness, the abode of Satan and his bad spirits, was established in direct opposition to the kingdom of the Saviour and his angels. The North had its own notion on this point. Its mythology was not without its own dark powers, but though they too were ejected and dispossessed, They, according to that mythology, had rights of their own. To them belonged all the universe that had not been seized and reclaimed by the younger race of Odin and Aesir. And though this upstart dynasty, as the frost giants in Promethean phrase would have called it, well knew that Hel, one of this giant progeny, was fated to do them all mischief and to outlive them, they took her and made her queen of Niflheim, and mistress over 9 worlds. There, in a bitterly cold place, she received the souls of all who died of sickness or old age. Care was her bed, hunger her dish, starvation her knife. Her walls were high and strong, and her bolts and bars huge. Half blue was her skin, and half the color of human flesh, a goddess easy to know, and in all things very stern and grim. Edda, chapter 34, English translation. But though severe, she was not an evil spirit. She only received those who died as no Norseman wished to die. For those who fell on the gory battlefield, or sank beneath the waves, Valhalla was prepared, and endless mirth and bliss with Odin. Those who went to Hel, who were rather unfortunate than wicked, who died before they could be killed. But when Christianity came in and ejected Odin and his crew of false divinities, declaring them to be lying gods and demons, then Hel fell with the rest; but fulfilling her fate, outlived them. From a person she became a place, and all the northern nations, from the Goth to the Norseman, agreed in believing Hel to be the abode of the devil and his wicked spirits, the place prepared from the beginning for the everlasting torments of the damned. One curious fact connected with this explanation of Hel's origin will not escape the reader's attention. The Christian notion of Hel is that of a place of heat, for in the East, whence Christianity came, heat is often an intolerable torment, and cold, on the other hand, everything that is pleasant and delightful. But to the dweller in the North, heat brings with it sensations of joy and comfort, and life without fire has a dreary outlook, so there Hel ruled in a cold region over those who were cowards by implication, while the mead cup went round, and huge logs blazed and crackled, in Valhalla, for the brave and beautiful who had dared to die on the field of battle. But under Christianity the extremes of heat and cold have met, and Hel, the cold uncomfortable goddess, is now our Hel, where flames and fire abound, and where the devils abide in everlasting flame. Still, popular tradition is tough, and even after centuries of Christian teaching, the Norse peasant, in his popular tales, can still tell of Hel as a place where firewood is wanted at Christmas, and over which a certain air of comfort breathes, though, as in the goddess Hel's halls, meat is scarce. The following passage from Why the Sea is Salt, No. 2, will sufficiently prove this. "Well, here is the flitch," said the rich brother, "and now go straight to Hel." "What I have given my word to do, I must stick to," said the other. So he took the flitch and set off. He walked the whole day, and at dusk he came to a place where he saw a very bright light. "Maybe this is the place," said the man to himself. So he turned aside, and the first thing he saw was an old, old man, with a long white beard, who stood in an outhouse, hewing wood for the Christmas fire. "Good even," said the man with the flitch. "The same to you. Whither are you going so late?" said the man. "Oh, I'm going to Hel, if I only knew the right way," answered the poor man. "Well, you're not far wrong, for this is Hel," said the old man. "When you get inside they will be all for buying your flitch, for meat is scarce in Hel. But mind you don't sell it, unless you get the hand quern which stands behind the door for it. When you come out, I'll teach you how to handle the quern, for it's good to grind almost anything." This, too, is the proper place to explain the conclusion of that intensely heathen tale, The Master Smith, No. 16. We have already seen how the Saviour and St. Peter supply, in its beginning, the place of Odin and some other heathen god. But when the smith sets out with the feeling that he has done a silly thing in quarrelling with the devil, having already lost his hope of heaven, this tale assumes a still more heathen shape. According to the old notion, those who were not Odin's guests went either to Thor's house, who had all the thralls, or to Frigga, who even claimed a third part of the slain on every battlefield with Odin, or to Hel, the cold comfortless goddess already mentioned, who was still no tormentor, though she ruled over 9 worlds, and though her walls were high and her bolts and bars huge; traits which come out in The Master Smith, No. 16, when the devil, who here assumes Hel's place, orders the watch to go back and lock up all the 9 locks on the gates of Hel, a lock for each of the goddess's 9 worlds, and put a padlock on besides. In the twilight between heathendom and Christianity, in that half-Christian half-heathen consciousness, which this tale reveals, heaven is the preferable abode, as Valhalla was of yore, but rather than be without a house to one's head after death, hell was not to be despised; though, having behaved ill to the ruler of one, and actually quarrelled with the master of the other, the smith was naturally anxious on the matter. This notion of different abodes in another world, not necessarily places of torment, comes out too in "Not a pin to choose between them", No. 24, where Peter, the second husband of the silly Goody, goes out begging from house to house in Paradise. For the rest, whenever the devil appears in these tales, it is not at all as the arch enemy, as the subtle spirit of the Christian's faith, but rather as one of the old giants, supernatural and hostile indeed to man, but simple and easily deceived by a cunning reprobate, whose superior intelligence he learns to dread, for whom he feels himself no match, and whom, finally, he will receive in hell at no price. We shall have to notice some of the other characteristics of this race of giants a little further on, but certainly no greater proof can be given of the small hold which the Christian devil has taken of the Norse mind than the heathen aspect under which he constantly appears, and the ludicrous way in which he is always outwitted. We have seen how our Lord and the saints succeeded to Odin and his children in the stories which told of their wanderings on earth, to warn the wicked or to help the good. We have seen how the kindliness and helpfulness of the ancient goddesses fell like a royal mantle round the form of the Virgin Mary. We have seen, too, on the other hand, how the procession of the Almighty God degenerated into the infernal midnight hunt. We have now to see what became of the rest of the power of the goddesses, of all that might which was not absorbed into the glory of the Blessed Virgin. We shall not have far to seek. No reader of early medieval chronicles and sermons can fail to have been struck with the many passages which ascribe majesty and power to beings of a woman's sex. Now it is a heathen goddess as Diana, now some half-historical figure as Bertha, now a mythical being as Holda, now Herodias, now Satia, now Domina Abundia, or Dame Habonde. A very short investigation will serve to identify the two ancient goddesses Frigga and Frigga with all these leaders of a midnight host. Just as Odin was banished from day to darkness, so the two great heathen goddesses, fused into one uncanny shape, were supposed to ride the air at night. Medieval chroniclers, writing in bastard Latin, and following the example of classical authors, when they had to find a name for this demon goddess, chose, of course, Diana, the heathen huntress, the moon goddess, and the ruler of the night. In the same way, when they threw Odin's name into a Latin shape, he, the god of wit and will, as well as power and victory, became Mercury. As for Herodias, not the mother but the daughter who danced, she must have made a deep impression on the mind of the early Middle Age, for she was supposed to have been cursed after the beheading of John the Baptist, and to have gone on dancing forever. When heathendom fell, she became confounded with the ancient goddesses, and thus we find her, sometimes among the crew of the Wild Huntsman, sometimes, as we see in the passages below, in company with, or in the place of, Diana, Holda, Satia, and Abundia, at the head of a bevy of women, who met at certain places to celebrate unholy rites and mysteries. As for Holda, Satia, and Abundia, the kind, the satisfying, and the abundant, they are plainly names of good rather than evil powers. They are ancient epithets drawn from the bounty of the good lady, and attest the feeling of respect which still clung to them in the popular mind. As was the case whenever Christianity was brought in, the country folk, always averse to change, as compared with the more lively and intelligent dwellers in towns, still remained more or less heathen; and to this day they preserve unconsciously many superstitions which can be traced up in lineal descent to their old belief. In many ways does the old divinity peep out under the new superstition. The long train, the midnight feast, the good lady who presides, the bounty and abundance which her votaries fancied would follow in her footsteps, all belong to the ancient goddess. Most curious of all is the way in which all these traditions from different countries insist on the third part of the earth, the third child born, the third soul as belonging to the good lady, who leads the revel, for this right of a third, or even a half, was one which Freyja possessed. But Freyja is most famous for the Asinjor. She has that bower in heaven hight Folkvenger, and whithersoever she rideth to the battle, there hath she one half of the slain, but Odin the other half. Again, when she fares abroad, she drives two cats and sits in a car, and she lends an easy ear to the prayers of men. Snorro's Edda, Dasent's translation, p. 29. Stockholm, 1842. We have got, then, the ancient goddesses identified as evil influences, and as the leader of a midnight band of women, who practiced secret and unholy rites. This leads us at once to witchcraft. In all ages and in all races this belief in sorcery has existed. Men and women practiced it alike, but in all times female sorcerers have predominated. This was natural enough. In those days women were priestesses. They collected drugs and simples. Women alone knew the virtues of plants. Those soft hands spun linen, made lint, and bound wounds. Women in the earliest times with which we are acquainted with our forefathers alone knew how to read and write, only they could carve the mystic runes, only they could chant the charms so potent to allay the wounded warrior's smart and pain. The men were busy out of doors with plowing, hunting, barter, and war. In such an age the sex which possessed by natural right book learning, physic, soothsaying, and incantation, even when they used these mysteries for good purposes, were but a step from sin. The same soft white hand that bound the wound and scraped the lint, the same gentle voice that sung the mystic rune, that helped the child-bearing woman, or drew the arrowhead from the dying champion's breast, the same bright eye that gazed up to heaven in ecstasy through the sacred grove and read the will of the gods when the mystic tablets and rune-carved lots were cast, all these, if the will were bad, if the soothsayer passed into the false prophetess, the leech into a poisoner, and the priestess into a witch, were as potent and terrible for ill as they had once been powerful for good. In all the Indo-European tribes, therefore, women, and especially old women, have practiced witchcraft from the earliest times, and Christianity found them wherever it advanced. But Christianity, as it placed mankind upon a higher platform of civilization, increased the evil which it found, and when it expelled the ancient goddesses, and confounded them as demons with Diana and Herodias, it added them and their votaries to the old class of malevolent sorcerers. There was but one step, but a simple act of the will, between the Norn and the hag, even before Christianity came in. As soon as it came, down went goddess, Valkyrie, Norn, priestess, and soothsayer, into that unholy deep where the heathen hags and witches had their being. And, as Christianity gathered strength, developed its dogmas and worked out its faith, fancy, tradition, leechcraft, poverty, and idleness, produced that unhappy class, the medieval witch, the persecution of which is one of the darkest pages in religious history. It is curious indeed to trace the belief in witches through the Middle Age, and to mark how it increases in intensity and absurdity. At first, as we have seen in the passages quoted, the superstition seemed comparatively harmless, and though the witches themselves may have believed in their unholy power, there were not wanting divines who took a common-sense view of the matter, and put the absurdity of their pretensions to a practical proof. Such was that good parish priest who asked, when an old woman of his flock insisted that she had been in his house with the company of the good lady, and had seen him naked and covered him up, "How, then, did you get in when all the doors were locked?" "We can get in," she said, "even if the doors are locked." Then the priest took her into the chancel of the church, locked the door, and gave her a sound thrashing with the pastoral staff, calling out, "Out with you, lady witch!" But as she could not, he sent her home, saying, "See how foolish you are to believe in such empty dreams." But as the Church increased in strength, as heresies arose, and consequent persecution, then the secret meetings of these sectarians, as we should now call them, were identified by the hierarchy with the rites of sorcery and magic, and with the relics of the worship of the old gods. By the time, too, that the hierarchy was established, that belief in the fallen angel, the arch-fiend, the devil, originally so foreign to the nations of the West, had become thoroughly engrafted on the popular mind, and a new element of wickedness and superstition was introduced at these unholy festivals. About the middle of the 13th century, we find the mania of persecuting heretics invading the tribes of the Teutonic race from France and Italy, backed by all the power of the Pope. Like jealousy, persecution too often makes the meat it feeds on, and many silly, if not harmless, superstitions were rapidly put under the ban of the Church. Now the good lady and her train began to recede, only they fill up the background while the Prince of Darkness steps, dark and terrible, in front, and soon draws after him the following of the ancient goddess. Now we hear stories of demoniac possession; now the witches adore a demon of the other sex. With the male element and its harsher, sterner nature, the sinfulness of these unholy assemblies is infinitely increased, folly becomes guilt, and guilt crime. From the middle of the 14th to the middle of the 17th century the history of Europe teems with processes against witches and sorcerers. Before the Reformation it reached its height, in the Catholic world, with the famous bull of Innocent VIII in 1484, the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the first of a long list of witch-finding books, and the zeal with which the state lent all the terrors of the law to assist the ecclesiastical inquisitors. Before the tribunals of these inquisitors, in the 15th century, innumerable victims were arraigned on the double charge of heresy and sorcery, for the crimes ran in couples, both being children and sworn servants of the devil. Would that the historian could say that with the era of the Reformation these abominations ceased. The Roman hierarchy, with her bulls and inquisitors, had sown a bitter crop, which both she and the Protestant churches were destined to reap; but in no part of the world were the laborers more eager and willing, when the fields were black to harvest, than in those very reformed communities which had just shaken off the yoke of Rome, and which had sprung in many cases from the very heretics whom she had persecuted and burnt, accusing them at the same time of the most malignant sorceries. Their excuse is, that no one is before his age. The intense personality given to the devil in the Middle Age had possessed the whole mind of Europe. We must take them as we find them, with their bright fancy, their earnest faith, their stern fanaticism, their revolting superstition, just as when we look upon a picture we know that those brilliant hues and tones, that spirit which informs the whole, could never be, were it not for the vulgar earths and soil out of which the glorious work of art is mixed and made. Strangely monotonous are all the witch trials of which Europe has so many to show. At first the accused denies, then under torture she confesses, then relapses and denies; tortured again, she confesses again, amplifies her story, and accuses others. When given to the stake, she not seldom asserts all her confessions to be false, which is ascribed to the power which the fiend still has over her. Then she is burnt and her ashes given to the winds. Those who wish to read one unexampled perhaps for barbarity and superstition, and more curious from the rest from the prominence given in it to a man, may find it in the trial of Dr. Fian, the Scotch wizard, "which doctor was register to the devil, that sundry times preached at North Brack (North Berwick, in East Lothian) kirk, to a number of notorious witches." But we advise no one to venture on a perusal of this tract who is not prepared to meet with the most unutterable accusations and crimes, the most cruel tortures, and the most absurd confessions, followed as usual by the stoutest denial of all that had been confessed, when torture had done her worst on poor human nature, and the soul reasserted at the last her supremacy over the body. One characteristic of all these witch trials is the fact, that in spite of their unholy connection and intrigues with the evil one, no witch ever attained to wealth and station by the aid of the Prince of Darkness. The pleasure to do ill is all the pleasure they feel. This fact alone might have opened the eyes of their persecutors, for if the devil had the worldly power which they represented him to have, he might at least have raised some of his votaries to temporal rank, and to the pomps and the vanities of this world. An old German proverb expresses this notorious fact, by saying, that "every 7 years a witch is 3 halfpence richer." And so with all the unholy means of hell at their command, they dragged out their lives, along with their black cats, in poverty and wretchedness. To this fate at last came the worshippers of the great goddess Freyja, whom our forefathers adored as the goddess of love and plenty, and whose car was drawn by those animals which popular superstition has ever since assigned to the old witch of our English villages. Section 6, Part 1. Part 2 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 6, Introduction Part 4, Norse Popular Tales, Part 2. The North was not free, any more than the rest of the Protestant world, from this direful superstition which ran over Europe like a pestilence in the 16th century. In Sweden especially, the witches and their midnight ridings to Blokulla, the Black Hill, gave occasion to processes as absurd and abominable as the trial of Dr. Fian and the witch findings of Hopkins. In Denmark the sorceresses were supposed to meet at Tromso, high up in Finnmark, or even on Hecla in Iceland. The Norse witches met at a blockhole of their own, or on the Dovrefell, or at other places in Norway or Finnmark. As might be expected, we find many traces of witchcraft in these tales, but it may be doubted whether these may not be referred rather to the old heathen belief in such arts still lingering in the popular mind than to the processes of the 15th and 16th centuries, which were far more a craze and mania of the educated classes acting under a mistaken religious fanaticism against popular superstitions, than a movement arising from the mass of the community. Still, in the Mastermaid, No. 11, the witch of a sister-in-law, who had rolled the apple over to the Prince, and so charmed him, was torn to pieces between 24 horses. The old queen in The Lassie and her Godmother, No. 27, tries to persuade her son to have the young queen burnt alive for a wicked witch, who was dumb, and had eaten her own babies. In East o' the Sun and West o' the Moon, No. 4, it is a wicked stepmother who has bewitched the Prince. In Bushy Bride, No. 45, the ugly bride charms the king to sleep, and is at last thrown, with her wicked mother, into a pit full of snakes. In the 12 Wild Ducks, No. 8, the wicked stepmother persuades the king that Snow White and Rosy Red is a witch, and almost persuades him to burn her alive. In Tatterhood, No. 47, the whole troop of witches come to keep their revels on Christmas Eve in the queen's palace, and snap off the young princess's head. It is hard indeed, in tales where Trolls play so great a part, to keep witch and Troll separate. But the above instances will show that the belief in the one, as distinct from the other, exists in the popular superstitions of the North. The frequent transformation of men into beasts, in these tales, is another striking feature. This power the gods of the Norsemen possessed, in common with those of all other mythologies. Europa and her bull, Leda and her swan, will occur at once to the reader's mind, and to come to closer resemblances, just as Athene appears in the Odyssey as an eagle or a swallow perched on the roof of the hall, Odyssey 3:372 and 22:239, so Odin flies off as a falcon, and Loki takes the form of a horse or bird. This was only part of that omnipotence which all gods enjoy. But the belief that men, under certain conditions, could also take the shape of animals, is primeval, and the traditions of every race can tell of such transformations. Herodotus had heard how the Neurians, a Slavonic race, passed for wizards amongst the Scythians and the Greeks settled round the Black Sea, because each of them once in the year became a wolf for a few days, and then returned to his natural shape. Pomponius Mela and St. Augustine, in his great treatise De Civitate Dei, tell the same story, and Virgil, in his Eclogues, has sung the same belief. The Latins called such a man a turnskin versipellis, an expression which exactly agrees with the Icelandic expression for the same thing, and which is probably the true original of our turncoat. In Petronius the superstition appears in its full shape, and is worth repeating. At the banquet of Trimalchion, Nicoros gives the following account of the turnskins of Nero's time. It happened that my master was gone to Capua, to dispose of some second-hand goods. I took the opportunity, and persuaded our guest to walk with me to the 5th milestone. He was a valiant soldier, and a sort of grim water-drinking Pluto. About cockcrow, when the moon was shining as bright as midday, we came among the monuments. My friend began addressing himself to the stars, but I was rather in a mood to sing or to count them. And when I turned to look at him, lo, he had already stripped himself and lain down his clothes near him. My heart was in my nostrils, and I stood like a dead man, but he circummincit vestimenta, and on a sudden became a wolf. Do not think I jest, I would not lie for any man's estate. But to return to what I was saying. When he became a wolf, he began howling, and fled into the woods. At first I hardly knew where I was, and afterwards, when I went to take up his clothes, they were turned into stone. Who then died with fear but I? Yet I drew my sword and went cutting the air right and left, until I reached the villa of my sweetheart. I entered the courtyard. I almost breathed my last, the sweat ran down my neck, my eyes were dim, and I thought I should never recover myself. My Melissa wondered why I was out so late, and said to me, "Had you come sooner you might have at least helped us, for a wolf has entered the farm, and worried all of our cattle. But he had not the best of the joke, for all he escaped, for our slave ran a lance through his neck." When I heard this, I could not doubt how it was, and, as it was clear daylight, ran home as fast as a robbed innkeeper. When I came to the spot where the clothes had been turned into stone, I could find nothing except blood. But when I got home, I found my friend the soldier in bed, bleeding at the neck like an ox, and a doctor dressing his wound. I then knew he was a turn-skin, nor would I ever have broke bread with him again, no, not if you had killed me. A man who had such a gift or greed was also called lycanthropus, or man-wolf, or wolf-man, which term the Anglo-Saxons translated literally in Canute's laws werwolf, and the early English werewolf. In the Old French he was loup-garou, which means the same thing, except that garou means man-wolf in itself without the antecedent loup; so that, as Madden observes, the whole word is one of those reduplications, of which we have an example in lukewarm. In Brittany he was bleis-garou and den-bleis, formed respectively from bleis, wolf, and den, man. Garou is merely a distorted form of were, or ver, man and loup. In later French the word became warle, whence the Scotch wrote, whirl, and whirlin. It was not likely that a belief so widely spread should not have extended itself to the north, and the grave assertions of Olaus Magnus in the 16th century, in his treatise De Gentibus Septentrionalibus, show how common the belief in werewolves was, in Sweden, so late as the time of Gustavus Vasa. In mythical times, the Volsunga Saga, Fornald's Sag, 1:130-131, expressly states of Sigmund and Sinfjotli that they became werewolves, which, we may remark, were Odin's sacred beasts, just in the same way as Brynhildr and the Valkyries, or Corse choosers, who followed the god of battles to the field, and chose the dead for Valhalla when the fight was done, became swan maidens, and took the shape of swans. In either case the wolf's skin or the swan's feathery covering was assumed and laid aside at pleasure, though the Volunder Quidr, in the Edda, and the stories of the fair Melusina, and other medieval swan maidens, show that anyone who seized that shape while thus laid aside had power over its wearer. In later times, when this old heroic belief degenerated into the notion of sorcery, it was supposed that a girdle of wolfskin thrown over the body, or even a slap on the face with a wolfskin glove, could transform the person upon whom the sorcerer practised into a shape of a ravening wolf, which fled at once to the woods, where he remained in that shape for a period which varied in popular belief for 9 days, 3, 7, or 9 years. While in this state he was especially ravenous after young children, whom he carried off as the werewolf carried off William in the old romance, though all werewolves did not treat their prey with the same tenderness as that werewolf treated William. But the favorite beast for Norse transformations in historic times, if we may judge from the evidence afforded by the sagas, was the bear, the king of all their beasts, whose strength and sagacity made him an object of great respect. This old belief, then, might be expected to be found in these Norse tales, and accordingly we find men transformed in them into various beasts. Of old these transformations, as we have already stated, were active, if we may use the expression, as well as passive. A man who possessed the gift frequently assumed the shape of a beast at his own will and pleasure, like the soldier of Petronius. Even now in Norway it is a matter of popular belief that Finns and Lapps, who from time immemorial have passed for their most skilful witches and wizards in the world, can at will assume the shape of bears; and it is a common thing to say of one of these beasts, when he gets unusually savage and daring, "That can be no Christian bear." On such a bear, in the parish of Ofodin, after he had worried to death more than 60 horses and 6 men, it is said that a girdle of bearskin, the infallible mark of a man thus transformed, was found when he was at last tracked and slain. The tale called Farmer Weathersky, No. 41 in this collection, shows that the belief of these spontaneous transformations still exists in popular tradition, where it is easy to see that Farmer Weathersky is only one of the ancient gods, degraded into a demon's shape. His sudden departure through the air, horse, sledge, and lad and all, and his answer, "I'm at home alike north and south, and east and west," his name itself, and his distant abode, surrounded with the corpses of the slain, sufficiently betray the divinity in disguise. His transformation, too, into a hawk, answers exactly to that of Odin when he flew away from the Frost Giant in the shape of that bird. But on these tales such transformations are for the most part passive; they occur not at the will of the person transformed, but through sorcery practiced on them by some one else. Thus the white bear in the beautiful story of East o' the Sun and West o' the Moon, No. 4, is a prince transformed by his stepmother, just as it is the stepmother who plays the same part in the romance of William and the Werewolf. So the horse in The Widow's Son, No. 44, is a prince over whom a king has cast that shape. So also in Lord Peter, No. 42, which is the full story of what we have only hitherto known in part as Puss in Boots, the cat is a princess bewitched by the Troll who had robbed her of her lands. So also in The Seven Foals, No. 43, and The 12 Wild Ducks, No. 8, the foals and the ducks are princes over whom that fate has come by the power of a witch or a troll, to whom an unwary promise had been given. Thoroughly mythic is the trait in The 12 Wild Ducks, where the youngest brother reappears with a wild duck's wing instead of his left arm, because his sister had no time to finish that portion of the shirt, upon the completion of which his retransformation depended. But we should ill understand the spirit of the Norsemen, if we supposed that these transformations into beasts were all that the national heart has to tell of beasts and their doings, or that, when they appear, they do so merely as men-beasts, without any power or virtue of their own. From the earliest times, side by side with these productions of the human mind which speak of the dealings of men with men, there has grown up a stock of traditions about animals and their relations with one another, which forms a true beast epic, and is full of the liveliest traits of nature. Here too it was reserved for Grimm to restore these traditions to their true place in the history of the human mind, and show that the poetry which treats of them is neither satirical nor didactic, though it may contain touches of both these artificial kinds of composition, but on the contrary, purely and intensely natural. It is epic, in short, springing out of that deep love of nature and close observation of the habits of animals, which is only possible in an early and simple stage of society. It used to be the fashion, when these beast traditions were noticed, to point to Aesop as their original, but Grimm has sufficiently proved, Reinhard Fuchs' Introduction, that what we see in Aesop is only the remains of a great world-old cycle of such traditions which had already, in Aesop's day, been subjected by the Greek mind to that critical process which a late state of society brings to bear on popular traditions; that they were then already worn and washed out and moralized. He had also shown how the same process went on till in Phaedrus nothing but the dry bones of the traditions, with a drier moral, are served up to the reader; and he has done justice on La Fontaine, who wrote with all the wanton licentiousness of his day, and frittered away the whole nature of his fables by the frivolity of his allusions to the artificial society of his time. Nor has he spared Lessing, who, though he saw through the poverty of Phaedrus as compared with Aesop, and was alive to the weakness of La Fontaine, still wandered about in the classical mist which hung heavy over the learning of the 18th century, and saw in the Greek form the perfection of all fable, when in Aesop it really appears in a state of degeneracy and decay. Here too, as in so many other things, we have a proof that the world is older than we think it. The beast fables in the Pancha Tantra and the Hitopadesa, the Indian parallels to Aesop, reveal, in the connection in which they occur, and in the moral use to which they are put, a state of society long past that simple early time in which such fictions arise. They must have sprung up in the East in the very dawn of time, and thence travelling in all directions, we find them after many centuries in various shapes, which admit of no mistake as to their first origin, at the very ends of the earth, in countries as opposite as the poles to each other; in New Zealand and Norway, in Central Africa and Servia, in the West Indies and in Mongolia, all separated by immense tracts of land or sea from their common centre. To the earnest inquirer, to one who believes that many dark things may yet be solved, it is very satisfactory to see that even Grimm, in his Reynard the Fox, is at a loss to understand why the North, properly so called, had none of the traditions which the Middle Age moulded into that famous beast epic. But since then the North, as the great master himself confesses in his later works, has amply avenged herself for the slight thus cast upon her by mistake. In the year 1834, when Grimm thus expressed his surprise on this point, the North had no such traditions to show in books indeed, but she kept them stored up in her heart in an abundance with which no other land perhaps can vie. This book at least shows how natural it seems to the Norse mind now, and how much more natural of course it seemed in earlier times, when sense went for as much, and reflection for so little, that beasts should talk, and how truly and faithfully it has listened and looked for the accents and character of each. The bear is still the king of beasts, in which character he appears in True and Untrue, No. 1, but here, as in Germany, he is no match for the fox in wit. Thus, Reynard plays him a trick which condemns him for ever to a stumpy tail in No. 23. He cheats him out of his share of a firkin of butter in No. 52. He is preferred as herdsman in No. 10, before either bear or wolf, by the old wife who wants some one to tend her flock. Yet all the while he professes immense respect for the bear, and calls him "lord", even when in the very act of outwitting him. In the tale called "Well Done and Ill Paid", No. 38, the crafty fox puts a finish to his misbehaviour to his Lord Bruin, by handing him over, bound hand and foot, to the peasant, and by causing his death outright. Here, too, we have an example, which we shall see repeated in the case of the giants, that strength and stature are not always wise, and that wit and wisdom never fail to carry the day against mere brute force. Another tale, however, restores the bear to his true place as the king of beasts, endowed not only with strength, but with something divine and terrible about him, which the Trolls cannot withstand. This is the Cat on the Dovrefell, No. 12, in connection with which it should be remembered that the same tradition existed in the 13th century in Germany, that the bear is called familiarly Grandfather in the north, and that the Lapps reckon him rather as akin to man than beasts; that they say he has the strength of 10 and the wit of 12 men. If they slay him, they formally beg his pardon, as do also the Ostiaks, a tribe akin to the Lapps, and bring him to their huts with great formalities and mystic songs. To the wolf, whose nickname is Greylegs, these tales are more complimentary. He is not the spiteful, stupid, greedy Isengrim of Germany and France. Not that Isengrim, of whom the old English fables of the 13th century tell us that he became a monk, but when the brethren wished to teach him his letters, that he might learn the Paternoster, all they could get out of him was lamb, lamb, nor could they ever get him to look to the cross, for his eyes, with his thoughts, were ever to the woodward. Duce, Illustration to Shakespeare, Vol. II, 33, Sect. 344, quoted in Reinhard Fuchs, 221. He appears, on the contrary, in The Giant who had no heart in his body, No. 9, as a kindly grateful beast, who repays tenfold out of the hidden store of his supernatural sagacity the gift of the old jade, which Boots had made over to him. The horse was a sacred animal among the Teutonic tribes from the first moment of their appearance in history, and Tacitus (Germania, 9 and 10) has related, how in the shade of these woods and groves which served them for temples, white horses were fed at the public cost, whose backs no mortal man crossed, whose neighings and snortings were carefully watched as auguries and omens, and who were thought to be conscious of divine mysteries. In Persia, too, the classical writer will remember how the neighing of a horse decided the choice for the crown. Here, in England, at any rate, we have only to think of Hengist and Horsa, the twin heroes of the Anglo-Saxon migration, as the legend ran, heroes whose name meant horse, and of the Vale of the White Horse, in Berkshire, where the sacred form still gleams along the down, to be reminded of the sacredness of the horse to our forefathers. The Eddas are filled with the names of famous horses, and the Sagas contain many stories of good steeds, in whom their owners trusted and believed as sacred to this or that particular god. Such a horse is Dapplegrim in No. 40 of these tales, who saves his master out of all his perils, and brings him to all fortune, and is another example of that mysterious connection with the higher powers which animals in all ages have been supposed to possess. Such a friend, too, to the helpless lassie is the dun bull in Katie Woodencloak, No. 1, out of whose ear comes the wishing cloth, which serves up the choicest dishes. The story is probably imperfect, as we would expect to see him again in human shape after his head was cut off and his skin flayed; but, after being the chief character up to that point, he remains from that time forth in the background, and we only see him darkly in the man who comes out of the face of the rock and supplies the lassie's wants when she knocks on it. Dun, or blue, or mouse colour, is the favourite colour for fairy kine. Thus the cow which Guy of Warwick killed was dun. The Huldror in Norway gave large flocks of blue kine. In Scotland runs the story of the mouse-coloured elfin bull. In Iceland the colour of such kine is apalgrar, dapple grey. This animal has been an object of adoration and respect from the earliest times, and we need only to remind our readers of the sanctity of cows and bulls among the Indians and Egyptians, or the golden calf in the Bible; of Io and her wanderings from land to land; and, though last, not least, of Audhumla, the mythic cow in the Edda, who had so large a part in the creation of the first giant in human forms. Sennaros's Edda, chap. 4, English translation. The dog, to which, with all his sagacity and faithfulness something unclean and impure clings, as Grimm well observes, plays no very prominent part in these tales. We find him, however, in Not a Pin to Choose Between Them, No. 24, where his sagacity fails to detect his mistress; and, as the foe of his own house, the half-bred foxy hound, who chases away the cunning fox in Well Done and Ill Paid, No. 38. Still he, too, in popular superstition, is gifted with the sense of the supernatural; he howls when death impends; and in Buttercup, No. 18, it is Goldtooth, their dog, who warns Buttercup and his mother of the approach of the old hag. In Bushy Bride, No. 45, he appears only as the lassie's lapdog, is thrown away as one of her sacrifices, and at last goes to the wedding in her coach, yet in that tale he has something weird about him, and he is sent out by his mistress 3 times to see if the dawn is coming. In one tale, No. 37, the goat appears in full force, and dashes out the brains of the Troll, who lived under the bridge over the burn. In another, Tatterhood, No. 48, he helps the lassie in her onslaught on the witches. He, too, was sacred to Thor in the old mythology, and drew his thundering car. Here something of the divine nature of his former lord, who was the great foe of all Trolls, seems to have been passed on in popular tradition to the animal who had seen so many adventures with the great god who swayed the thunder. This feud between the goat and the Trolls comes out curiously in The Old Dame and her Hen, No. 3, where a goat falls down the trapdoor to the Troll's house. "Who sent for you, I should like to know, you long-bearded beast", said the Man o' the Hill, who was in an awful rage; and with that he whipped up the goat, wrung his head off, and threw him down into the cellar. Still, he belonged to one of the heathen gods, and so in later Middle Age superstition he is assigned to the Devil, who even takes his shape when he presides at the witches' sabbath. Nor in this list must the little birds be forgotten which taught the man's daughter, in the tale of the two stepsisters, No. 17, how to act in her trials. So too in Katie Woodencloak, No. 50, the little bird tells the Prince, who understood the song of birds very well, that blood is gushing out of the golden shoe. The belief that some persons had the gift of understanding what the birds said, is primeval. We pay homage to it in our proverbial expression, "a little bird told me." Popular traditions and rhymes protect their nests, as in the case of the wren, the robin, and the swallow. Occasionally this gift seems to have been acquired by eating or tasting the flesh of a snake or dragon, as Sigurd in the Volsung tale first became aware of Regin's designs against his life, when he accidentally tasted the heart-blood of Fafnir, whom he had slain in dragon shape, and then all at once the swallow's song, perched above him, became as intelligible as human speech. We now come to a class of beings which plays a large part, and always for ill, in these tales. These are the Giants, or Trolls. In modern Norse tradition there is little difference between the names, but originally Troll was a more general expression for a supernatural being than Giant, which was rather confined to a race more dull than wicked. In the Giants we have the wantonness of boundless bodily strength and size, which, trusting entirely to these qualities, falls at last by its own weight. At first, it is true that proverbial wisdom, all the stores of traditional lore, all that can be learnt by what we may call rule of thumb, was ascribed to them. One sympathizes, too, with them, and almost pities them as the representatives of a simple primitive race, whose day is past and gone, but who still possessed something of the innocence and virtue of ancient times, together with a stock of old experience, which, however useful it might be as an example to others, was quite useless to help themselves. They are the old Tories of mythology, as opposed to the Aesir, the advanced liberals. They can look back and say what has been, but to look forward to say what will be, and shall be, and to mould the future, is beyond their ken. True as gold to the traditional and received, and worthless as dross for the new and progressive. Such a nature, when unprovoked, is easy and simple, but rouse it, and its exuberant strength rises in a paroxysm of rage, though its clumsy awkward blows, guided by mere cunning, fail to strike the slight and lissom foe who waits for and eludes the stroke, until his reason gives him the mastery over sheer brute force which has wearied itself out by its own exertions. This race, and that of the upstart Aesir, though almost always at feud, still have their intervals of common intercourse, and even social enjoyment. Marriages take place between them, visits are paid, feasts are given, ale is breached, and mirth is fast and furious. Thor was the worst foe the giants ever had, and yet he met them sometimes on good terms. They were destined to meet once and for all on that awful day, the twilight of the gods, but till then, they entertained for each other some sense of mutual respect. The Trolls, on the other hand, with whom mankind had more to do, were supposed to be less easy-tempered, and more systematically malignant, than the giants, and with the term were bound up notions of sorcery and unholy power. But mythology is a woof of many colors, of which the hues are shot and blended, so that the various races of supernatural beings are shaded off, and fade away almost imperceptibly into each other; and thus, even in heathen times, it must have been hard to say exactly where the giant ended and the Troll began. But when Christianity came in, and heathendom fell, when the godlike race of the Aesir became evil demons instead of good genial powers, then all the objects of the old popular belief, whether Aesir, giants, or Trolls, were mingled together in one superstition, as no canny. They were all Trolls, all malignant; and thus it was that, in these tales, the traditions about Odin and his underlings, about the Frost Giants, and about sorcerers and wizards, are confused and garbled; and all supernatural agency that plots man's ill is the work of Trolls, whether the agent be the arch-enemy himself, or giant, or witch, or wizard. In tales such as The Old Dame and her Hen, No. 3, The Giant who had no heart in his body, No. 9, Shortshanks, No. 20, Boots and the Troll, No. 32, Boots who ate a match with the Troll, No. 5, the easy temper of the old Frost Giants predominates, and we almost pity them as we read. In another, The Big Bird Dan, No. 55, we have a Troll Prince, who appears as a generous benefactor to the young Prince, and lends him a sword by help of which he slays the King of the Trolls, just as we sometimes find in the Edda friendly meetings between the Aesir and this, or the Frost Giant. In Tatterhood, No. 48, the Trolls are very near akin to the witches of the Middle Age. In other tales, as The Mastermind, No. 11, The Blue Belt, No. 22, Farmer Weathersky, No. 41, a sort of settled malignity against man appears as the direct working and result of a bad and evil spirit. In Buttercup, No. 18, and The Cat in the Dovrefell, we have the Troll proper, the supernatural dwellers of the woods and hills, who go to church and eat men and porridge and sausages indifferently, not from malignity, but because they know no better, because it is their nature, and because they have always done so. In one point they all agree, in their place of abode. The wild pine forest that clothes the spurs of the fells, but more than all, the interior recesses of the rocky fell itself, is where the Trolls live. Thither they carry off the children of men, and to them belongs all the untold riches of the mineral world. There, in caves and clefts in the steep face of the rock, sits the Troll, as the representative of the old giants, among heaps of gold and silver and precious things. They stride off into the dark forest by day, whither no rays of the sun can pierce. They return home at nightfall, feast themselves full, and snore out the night. One thing was fatal to them, the sight of the sun. If they looked him full in the face, his glory was too great for them, and they burst, as in Lord Peter, No. 42, and in The Old Dame and her Hen, No. 3. This, too, is a deeply mythic trait. The old religion of the North was a bright and lively faith. It lived in the light of joy and gladness. Its gods were the blithe powers. Opposed to them were the dark forces of mist and gloom, who could not bear the glorious face of the sun, of Baldur's beaming visage, or the bright flash of Thor's levin bolt. In one aspect, the whole race of giants and trolls stands out in strong historical light. There can be little doubt that, in their continued existence amongst the woods and rocks and hills, we have a memory of the gradual suppression and extinction of some hostile race, who gradually retired into the natural fastnesses of the land, and speedily became mythic. Nor, if we bear in mind their natural position, and remember how constantly the infamy of sorcery has clung to the Finns and Lapps, shall we have far to go to seek this ancient race, even at the present day. Between this outcast nomad race, which wandered from forest to forest and from fell to fell, without a fixed place of abode, and the old natural powers and frost giants, the minds of the race which adored Odin and the Aesir soon engendered a monstrous man-eating cross-breed of supernatural beings, who fled from contact with the intruders as soon as the first great struggle was over, abhorred the light of day, and looked upon agriculture and tillage as a dangerous innovation which destroyed their hunting fields, and was destined finally to root them out from off the face of the earth. This fact appears in countless stories all over the globe, for man is true to himself in all climes, and the savage in Africa or across the Rocky Mountains dreads tillage and detests the plough as much as any Lapp or Samoyed. "See what pretty playthings, mother!" cries the Giant's daughter as she unties her apron, and shows her a plough, and horses, and peasants. "Back with them this instant!" cries the mother in wrath, "and put them down as carefully as you can, for these playthings can do our race great harm, and when these come we must budge." "What sort of an earthworm is this?" said one Giant to another, when they met a man as they walked. "These are the earthworms that will one day eat us up, brother," answered the other; and soon both Giants left that part of Germany. Nor does this trait appear less strongly in these Norse tales. The Giants or Trolls can neither brew nor wash properly, as we see in Shortshanks, No. 20, where the Ogre has to get Shortshanks to brew his ale for him; and in East of the Sun and West of the Moon, No. 4, where none of the Trolls are able to wash out the spot of tallow. So also in the Two Step-sisters, No. 17, the old witch is forced to get human maids to do her household work; and lastly, the best example of all, in Lord Peter, No. 42, where agriculture is plainly a secret of mankind, which the Giants were eager to learn, but which was a branch of knowledge beyond their power to attain. "Stop a bit", said the Cat, "and I'll tell you how the farmer sets to work to get in his winter rye." And so she told him such a long story about the winter rye. First of all, you see, he ploughs the field, and then he dungs it, and then he ploughs it again, and then he harrows it, and so she went on until the sun rose. Before we leave these gigantic natural powers, let us linger a moment to point out how heartily the winds are sketched in these tales as four brothers, of whom, of course, the North Wind is the oldest, and strongest, and roughest. But though rough in form and tongue, he is a genial, kind-hearted fellow after all. He carries the lassie to the castle, East of the Sun and West of the Moon, whither none of his brothers had strength to blow. All he asks is that she won't be afraid, and then he takes a good rest, and puffs himself up with as much breath as ever he can hold, begins to blow a storm, and off they go. So, too, in the Lad who went to the North Wind, No. 34, though he can't restore the meal he carried off, he gives the lad 3 things which make his fortune, and amply repay him. He, too, like the Grecian Boreas, is divine, and lineally descended from Hraesvelgr, that great giant in the Edda, who sits at the end of the world in eagle's shape, and when he flaps his wings, all the winds come that blow upon men. Enough surely has now been said to shew that the old religion and mythology of the Norsemen still lives disguised in these popular tales. Besides this internal evidence, we find here and there, in the written literature of earlier days, hints that the same stories were even then current, and current then as now, among the lower classes. Thus, in King Sverri's Saga we read, "And so it is just like what is said to have happened in the old stories of what the king's children suffered from their stepmother's ill will." And again, in Olaf Tryggvason's Saga, by the monk Odd, "And better is it to hear such things with mirth, than stepmother's stories which shepherds tell, where no one can tell whether anything is true, and where the king is always made the least in their narrative." But in truth, no such positive evidence is needed. Any one who has read the Volsung tale as we have given it, will be at no loss to see where the little birds who speak to the prince and the lassie in these tales come from; nor when they read in the Big Bird Dan, No. 55, about the naked sword, which the princess lays by her side every night, will they fail to recognize Sigurd's sword Gram, which he laid beside himself and Brynhildr when he rode through the flame and won her for Gunnar. These mythical deep-rooted groves, throwing out fresh shoots from age to age in the popular literature of the race, are far more convincing proofs of the early existence of these traditions than any mere external evidence. End of Section 6, Part 2.
7 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Daniel W. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 7. Introduction Part 5. Conclusion. We have now only to consider the men and women of these tales, and then our task is done. It will be sooner done, because they may be left to speak for themselves, and must stand or fall by their own words and actions. The tales of all races have a character and manner of their own. Among the Hindus, the straight stem of the story is overhung with a network of imagery, which reminds one of the parasitic growth of a tropical forest. Among the Arabs, the tale is more elegant, pointed with a moral, and adorned with tropes and episodes. Among the Italians it is bright, light, dazzling, and swift. Among the French we have passed from the woods and fields and hills to my lady's boudoir. Rose pink is the prevailing color, and the air is loaded with patchouli and mille fleurs. We miss the song of birds, the modest odor of the wildflowers, and the balmy fragrance of the pine forest. The Swedes are more stiff, and their style is more like that of a chronicle than of a tale. The Germans are simple, hearty, and rather comic than humorous, and M. Moe has well said that as we read them it is as if we sat and listened to some elderly woman of the middle class, who recites them with a clear, full, deep voice. In Scotland, the few that have been collected by Mr. Robert Chambers are as good in tone and keeping as anything of the kind in the whole range of such popular collections. The wonderful likeness which is shown between such tales as The Red Bull of Norway in Mr. Chambers' collection, and Katie Woodencloak in these Norse tales, is to be accounted for by no theory of the importation of this or that particular tale in later times from Norway, but by the fact that the lowland Scots, among whom these tales were told, were lineal descendants of Norsemen, who had either seized the country in Viking times, or had been driven into it across the border after the Norman conquest. These Norse tales we may characterize as bold, outspoken, and humorous in the true sense of humor. In the midst of every difficulty and danger arises that old Norse feeling of making the best of everything, and keeping a good face to the foe. The language and tone are perhaps rather lower than in some other collections, but it must be remembered that these are the tales of hempen homespuns, of Norse yeomen, of norske bonder, who call a spade, and who burn tallow, not wax. And yet in no collection of tales is the general tone so chaste, are the great principles of morality better worked out, and right and wrong kept so steadily in sight. The general view of human nature is good and kindly. The happiness of married life was never more prettily told than in Gudbrand on the Hillside, number 21, where the tenderness of the wife for her husband weighs down all other considerations. And we all agree with M. Moe that it would be well if there were many wives like Gudbrand's. The balance, too, is very evenly kept between the sexes, for if any wife should point with indignation at a tale as not a pin to choose between them, number 24, where wives suffer, she will be amply avenged when she reads The Husband Who Was to Mind the House, number 39, where the husband has decidedly the worst of the bargain, and is punished as he deserves. Of particular characters, one occurs repeatedly. This is that which we have ventured, for want of a better word, to call boots, from that widely spread tradition in English families, that the youngest brother is bound to do all the hard work his brothers set him, and which has also dignified him with the term here used. In Norse he is called Askvis, or Espen Askvigis. By M. Moe he is called Askepå, a word which the Danes got from Germany, and which the readers of Grimm's Tales will see at once is own brother to Aschenputtel. The meaning of the word is one who pokes about the ashes and blows up the fire, one who does dirty work, in short, and in Norway, according to M. Moe, the term is almost universally applied to the youngest son of the family. He is Cinderella's brother, in fact, and just as she had all the dirty work put upon her by her sisters, he meets with the same fate from his brothers. He is generally the youngest of three, whose names are often Peter and Paul, as in number 42, and who despise, cry down, and mock him. But he has in him that deep strength of character and natural power upon which the good powers always smile. He is the man whom heaven helps, because he can help himself, And so, after his brothers try and fail, he alone can watch in the barn, and tame the steed, and ride up the grass hill, and gain the princess and half the kingdom. The Norse Boots shares these qualities in common with the Pinkel of the Swedes, and the Dummling of the Germans, as well as with our Jack the Giant Killer. But he starts lower than these. He starts from the dustbin and the coal hole. There he sits idle, whilst all work. There he lies with that deep irony of conscious power, which knows its time must one day come, and meantime can afford to wait. When that time comes, he girds himself up to the feet, amidst the scoffs and scorn of his flesh and blood. But even then, after he has done some great deed, he conceals it, returns to his ashes, and again sits idly by the kitchen fire, dirty, lazy, and despised, until the time for final recognition comes, and then his dirt and rags fall off. He stands out in all the majesty of the royal robes, and is acknowledged once for all a king. In this way does the consciousness of a nation, and the mirror of its thought, reflect the image and personification of a great moral truth, that modesty, endurance, and ability will sooner or later reap their reward, however much they may be degraded, scoffed at, and despised by the proud, the worthless, and the overbearing. As a general rule, the women are less strongly marked than the men, for these tales, as is well said, are uttered with a manly mouth, and none of the female characters, except perhaps the Master-Maid and Tatterhood, can compare in strength with the Master-Smith, the Master-Thief, Shortshanks, or Boots. Still, the true womanly type comes out in full play, in such tales as The Two Step-Sisters, number 27, East o' the Sun and West o' the Moon, number 4, Bushy Bride, number 65, and The 12 Wild Ducks, number 8. In all these the lassie is bright, and good, and helpful. She forgets herself in her eagerness to help others. When she goes down the well after the unequal match against her step-sister in spinning bristles against flax, she steps tenderly over the hedge, milks the cow, shears the sheep, relieves the boughs of the apple tree, all out of the natural goodness of her heart. When she is sent to fetch water from the well, she washes and brushes, and even kisses the loathsome head. She believes what her enemies say, even to her own wrong and injury. She sacrifices all that she holds most dear, and at last even herself, because she is made to believe that it is her brother's wish. And so on her, too, the good powers smile. She can understand and profit by what the little birds say. She knows how to choose the right casket. And at last, after many trials, all at once the scene changes, and she receives a glorious reward, while the wicked stepmother and her ugly daughter meet with a just fate. Nor is another female character less tenderly drawn in Hakon Grizzlebeard, number 6, where we see the proud, haughty princess subdued and tamed by natural affection into a faithful, loving wife. We sympathize with her more than with the patient Grizzle of the poets, who is in reality too good, for his story has no relief. While in Hakon Grizzlebeard we begin by being angry at the princess's pride. We are glad at the retribution which overtakes her, but we are gradually melted at her sufferings and hardships when she gives up all for the beggar and follows him. We burst into tears with her when she exclaims, "Oh, the beggar, and the babe, and the cabin!" And we rejoice with her when the prince says, "Here is the beggar, and there is the babe, and so let the cabin burn away." Nor is it unprofitable here to remark how the professions fare when they appear in these tales. The church cannot be said to be treated with respect, for Father Lawrence is ludicrously deceived and scurvily treated by the Master Thief in number 35, nor does the priest come off any better in Goosey Grizzle, number 33, where he is thrown by the farmer into the wet moss. Indeed, it seems as if the popular mind were determined to revenge itself when left to itself, for the superstition in Rome in one hand and the severity of strict Lutheranism on the other. It has little to say of either of them, but when it does speak, its accents are not those of reverence and love. The law, too, as represented by those awful personages the constable, the attorney, and the sheriff in The Master-Maid, number 9, is held up to ridicule, and treated with anything but tenderness. But there is one profession for which a good word is said, a single word, but enough to show the feeling of all the people. In The 12 Wild Ducks, number 8, the king is as soft and kind to Snow White and Rosy Red as a doctor. A doctor, alas, not of laws, but of medicine, and thus this profession, so often despised, but in reality the noblest, has homage paid to it in that single sentence, which neither the Church with all its dignity, nor the law with all its cunning, have been able to extort from the popular mind. Yet even this profession has a hard word uttered against it in Katie Woodencloak, No. 1, where the doctor takes a great fee from the wicked queen to say she will never be well unless she has some of the dun bull's flesh to eat. And now it is time to bring this introduction to an end, lest it should play the wolf's part to Odin and swallow up the tales themselves. Enough has been said, at least, to prove that even nursery tales may have a science of their own, and to show how the old Nornir and divine spinners can revenge themselves if their old wives' tales are insulted and attacked. The inquiry itself might be almost indefinitely prolonged, for this is a journey where each turn of the road brings out a new point of view, and the longer we linger on our path, the longer we find something fresh to see. Popular mythology is a virgin mine, and its ore, so far from being exhausted or worked out, has here, in England at least, been scarcely touched. It may, indeed, be dreaded lest the time for collecting such English traditions is not past and gone, whether the steam engine and printing press have not played their great work of enlightenment too well, and whether the popular tales, of which no doubt the land was once full, have not faded away before those great inventions, as the race of giants waned before the might of Odin and the Aesir. Still, the example of this very Norway, which at one time was thought, even by her own sons, to have few tales of her own, and now has been found to have them so fresh and full, may serve as a warning not to abandon a search which, indeed, can scarcely be said to have been ever begun, and to suggest a doubt whether the ill success may have attended this or that particular attempt may not have been from the fault rather of the seekers themselves after traditions than from the want of the traditions themselves. In point of fact, it is a matter of the utmost difficulty to gather such tales in any country, as those who have collected them most successfully will be the first to confess. It is hard to make old and feeble women, who are generally the depositaries of these natural treasures, believe that the inquirer can have any real interest in the matter. They fear that the question is only to put them into ridicule, for the popular mind is a sensitive plant. It becomes coy, and closes its leaves at the first rude touch, and when once shut, it is hard to make these aged lips reveal the secrets of the memory. There they remain, however, forming part of an undercurrent of tradition, of which the educated classes, through whose minds flowed the bright upper current of faith, are apt to forget the very existence. Things out of sight, and therefore out of mind. Now and then a wave of chance tosses them to the surface from those hidden depths, and all her Majesty's inspectors of schools are shocked at the wild shapes which still haunt the minds of the great mass of the community. It cannot be said that the English are not a superstitious people. Here we have gone on for more than 100 years proclaiming our opinion that the belief in witches and wizards and ghosts and fetches was extinct throughout the land. Ministers of all denominations have preached them down, and philosophers convinced all the world of the absurdity of such vain superstitions. And yet it has been reserved for another learned profession, the law, to produce in one trial at the Staffordshire Assizes, a year or two ago, such a host of witnesses who firmly believed in witchcraft, and swore to their belief in spectre dogs and wizards, as to show that, in the Midland countries at least, such traditions are anything but extinct. If so much of the bad has been spared by steam, by natural philosophy, and by the Church, let us hope that some of the good may still linger along with it, and that an English Grimm may yet arise who may carry out what Mr. Chambers has so well begun in Scotland, and discover in the mouth of an Anglo-Saxon Gammer Grethel some, at least, of those popular tales, which England once had in common with all the Aryan race. For these Norse tales one may say nothing which can equal the tenderness and skill with which M.M. Asbjørnsen and Moe have collected them. Some of that tenderness and beauty may, it is hoped, be found in this English translation, but to those who have never been in the country where they are current, and who are not familiar with that hearty simple people, no words can tell the freshness and truth of the originals. It is not that the idioms of the two languages are different, for they are more nearly aligned, both in vocabulary and construction, than any other two tongues, but it is the face of nature herself, and the character of the race that looks up to her, that fail to the mind's eye. The west coast of Scotland is something like that nature in a general way, except that it is infinitely smaller and less grand. but that constant bright blue sky, those deeply indented, sinuous, gleaming frises, those headstrong rivers and headlong falls, those steep hillsides, those long ridges of fells, those peaks and needles rising sharp above them, those hanging glaciers and wreaths of everlasting snow, those towering, endless pine forests relieved by slender stems of silver birch, those green spots in the midst of the forest, those winding dales and upland lakes, those various shapes of birds and beasts, the mighty crashing elk, the fleet reindeer, the fearless bear, the nimble lynx, the shy wolf, those eagles and swans and sea-birds, those many tones and notes of nature's voice making distant music through the twilight summer night, those brilliant, flashing northern lights when days grow short, those dazzling, blinding storms of autumn snow, that cheerful winter frost and cold, that joy of sledging over the smooth ice, when the sharp-shod horse careers at full speed with the light sledge, or rushes down the steep pitches over the crackling snow, through the green spruce wood, all of these form a nature of their own. These particular features belong in their fullness and combination to no other land. When in the midst of all this natural scenery, we find an honest, manly race, not the race of towns and cities, but of the dales and fells, free and unsubdued, holding its own in a country where there are neither lords nor ladies, but simple men and women, brave men and fair women, who cling to the traditions of their forefathers, and whose memory reflects as from the faithful mirror of their native steel the whole history and progress of their race. When all these natural features and such a manly race meet, then we have the stuff out of which these tales are made, the living rocks out of which these sharp-cut national forms are hewn. Then, too, our task of introducing them is over. We may lay aside our pen, and leave the reader and the tales to themselves. End of section 7. Recording by Daniel W.
Section 8 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Siren Darktail. Popular Tales from the Norse, by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 8. True and Untrue. Once upon a time there were two brothers. One was called True, and the other Untrue. True was always upright and good towards all, but Untrue was bad and full of lies, so that no one could believe what he said. Their mother was a widow, and hadn't much to live on, so when her sons had grown up, she was forced to send them away, that they might earn their bread in the world. Each got a little scrip with some food in it, and then they went their way. Now, when they had walked till evening, they sat down on a windfall in the wood and took out their scraps, for they were hungry after walking the whole day, and thought a morsel of food would be sweet enough. "If you're of my mind," said Untrue, "I think I'd better eat out of your scrip, so long as there is anything in it, and after that we can take to mine." Yes, True was well pleased with this, so they fell to eating, but Untrue got all the best bits, and stuffed himself with them, while True got only the burnt crusts and scraps. Next morning they broke their fast off True's food, and they dined of it too, and then there was nothing left in his scrip. So when they had walked till late at night and were ready to eat again, True wanted to eat out of his brother's scrip, but Untrue said no, the food was his, and he had only enough for himself. "Aye, but you know you ate out of my scrip so long as there was anything in it." "All very fine, I dare say," answered Untrue, "but if you're such a fool as to let others eat up your food before your face, you must make the best of it, for now all you have to do is sit here and starve." "Very well," said True. "You're Untrue by name, and untrue by nature. So you have been, and so you will be all your life long." Now when Untrue heard this, he flew into a rage and rushed at his brother and plucked out both his eyes. "Now try if you can see whether folk are untrue or not, you blind buzzard." And so saying, he ran away and left him. Poor True! There he went, walking along and feeling his way through the thick wood. Blind and alone, he scarce knew which way to turn, when all at once he caught hold of the trunk of a great bushy lime tree, so he thought he could climb up into it and sit there till the night was over for the fear of the wild beasts. When the birds began to sing, he said to himself, Then I shall know it is day, and I can try to grope my way farther on." So he climbed up into the lime tree. After he had sat there a little time, he heard how someone came and began to make a stir and clatter under the tree, and soon after others came. And when they began to greet one another, he found out it was Bruin the bear, and Greylegs the wolf, and Slybus the fox, and Longears the hare, who had come to keep St. John's Eve under the tree. So they began to eat and drink and be merry, and when they had done eating, they fell to gossiping together. At last the fox said, "Shouldn't we, each of us, tell a little story while we sit here?" Well, the others had nothing against that. It would be good fun, they said, and the bear began, for you may fancy he was king of the company.
"The King of England," said Bruin, "has such bad eyesight he can scarce see a yard before him. But if he only came to this lime tree in the morning, while the dew is still on the leaves, and took and rubbed his eyes with dew, he would get his sight as good as ever." "Very true," said Greylegs. "The King of England has a deaf and dumb daughter too, but if he only knew what I know, he would soon cure her. Last year she went to the communion. She let a crumb of bread fall out of her mouth, and a great toad came and swallowed it down. But if they only dug up the chancel floor, they would find the toad sitting right under the altar rails, with the bread still sticking in his throat. If they were to cut the toad open, and take and give the bread to the princess, she would be like other folk again, as to her speech and hearing."
"That's all very well," said the fox, "but if the King of England knew what I know, he would not be so badly off for water in his palace. For under the great stone in his palace yard is a spring of the clearest water one could wish for, if he only knew to dig for it there." "Ah," said the hare in a smaller voice, "the King of England has the finest orchard in the whole land, but it does not bear so much as a crab, for there lies a heavy gold chain in 3 turns round the orchard. If he got that dug up, there would not be a garden like it for bearing in all his kingdom." "Very true, I dare say," said the fox, "but now it's getting very late, and we may as well go home." So they all went away together. After they were gone, True fell asleep as he sat up in the tree. But when the birds began to sing at dawn, he woke up, and took the dew from the leaves, and rubbed his eyes with it, and so got his sight back as good as it was before Aunt True plucked his eyes out. Then he went straight to the King of England's palace, and begged for work, and got it on the spot. So one day the king came out into the palace yard, and when he had walked about a bit, he wanted to drink out of his pump. For you must know the day was hot, and the king very thirsty. But when they poured him out a glass, it was so muddy and nasty and foul that the king got quite vexed. "I don't think there's ever a man in my whole kingdom who has such bad water in his yard as I, and yet I bring it in pipes from far over hill and dale," cried out the king. "Like enough, your majesty," said True, "but if you would let me have some men to help me dig up this great stone which lies here in the middle of your yard, you would soon get good water, and plenty of it." Well, the king was willing enough, and they had scarcely got the stone well out, and dug under it a while, before a jet of water sprang out high up into the air, as clear and full as if it came out of a conduit, and clearer water was not to be found in all England. A little while after, the king was out in his palace yard again, and there came a great hawk flying after his chicken, and all the king's men began to clap their hands and bawl out, "There he flies! There he flies!" The king caught up his gun and tried to shoot the hawk, but he couldn't see so far, so he fell into great grief. "Would to heaven," he said, "there was anyone who could tell me a cure for my eyes, for I think I shall soon go quite blind." "I can tell you one soon enough," said True. And then he told the king what he had done to cure his own eyes, and the king set off that very afternoon to the lime tree, as you may fancy, and his eyes were quite cured as soon as he rubbed them with the dew which was on the leaves in the morning. From that time forth there was no one whom the king held so dear as True, and he had to be with him wherever he went, both at home and abroad. So one day, as they were walking together in the orchard, the king said, "I can't tell how it is that I can't. There isn't a man in England who spends so much in his orchard as I, and yet I can't get one of the trees to bear so much as a crab." "Well, well," said True, "if I may have what lies 3 times twisted round your orchard, and men to dig it up, Your orchard will bear well enough." Yes, the king was quite willing, so True got men and began to dig, and at last he dug up the whole gold chain. Now True was a rich man, far richer indeed than the king himself, but still the king was well pleased, for his orchard bore so that the boughs of the trees hung down to the ground, and such sweet apples and pears nobody had ever tasted. Another day, too, the king and True were walking about and talking together when the princess passed them, and the king was quite downcast when he saw her. "Isn't it a pity, now, that so lovely a princess as mine should want speech and hearing?" he said to True. "Aye, but there is a cure for that," said True. When the king heard that, he was so glad that he promised him the princess to wife, and half his kingdom into the bargain, if he could get her right again. So True took a few men, and went into the church, and dug up the toad which sat under the altar rails. Then he cut open the toad, and took out the bread, and gave it to the king's daughter. And from that hour she got back her speech, and could talk like other people. Now True was to have the princess, and they got ready for the bridal feast, and such a feast had never been seen before. It was the talk of the whole land. Just as they were in the midst of dancing the bridal dance, in came a beggar lad, and begged for a morsel of food, and he was so ragged and wretched that every one crossed themselves when they looked at him. But True knew him at once. He saw that it was Untrue, his brother. "Do you know me again?" said True. "Oh, where should such as one as I ever have seen so great a lord?" said Untrue. "Still you have seen me before," said True. "It was I whose eyes you plucked out a year ago this very day. Untrue by name and untrue by nature, so I said before and so I say it now. But you are still my brother, and so you shall have some food. After that you may go to the lime tree where I sat last year. If you hear anything that can do you good, you will be lucky." So Untrue did not wait to be told twice. "If True has got so much good by sitting in the lime tree that in 1 year he has come to be king of half England, what good may I not get?" he thought. So he set off and climbed up into the lime tree. He had not sat there long before all the beasts came as before, and ate and drank, and kept St. John's Eve under the tree. When they had left off eating, the fox wished that they should begin to tell stories, and Untrue got ready to listen with all his might, till his ears were almost fit to fall off. But Bruin the bear was surly, and growled and said, "Someone had been chattering about what we said last year, and so now we will hold our tongues about what we know." And with that the beasts said one another good night and parted. And Untrue was just as wise as he was before, and the reason was that his name was Untrue, and his nature untrue too. End of section 8.
Of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian von Diedenroth. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 9. Why the Sea is Salt. Once on a time, but it was a long, long time ago, there were 2 brothers, one rich and one poor. Now, one Christmas Eve, the poor one hadn't so much as a crumb in the house, either of meat or bread. So he went to his brother to ask him for something to keep Christmas with, in God's name. It was not the first time his brother had been forced to help him, and you may fancy he wasn't very glad to see his face. But he said, "If you will do what I ask you to do, I'll give you a whole flitch of bacon." So the poor brother said he would do anything, and was full of thanks. "Well, here is the flitch," said the rich brother. "And now, go straight to hell." "What I have given my word to do, I must stick to," said the other. So he took the flitch and set off. He walked the whole day, and at dusk he came to a place where he saw a very bright light. "Maybe this is the place," said the man to himself. So he turned aside, and the first thing he saw was an old, old man with a long white beard, who stood in an outhouse, hewing wood for the Christmas fire. Good even, said the man with the flitch. The same to you. Whither are you going so late? Said the man. Oh, I'm going to hell, if I only knew the right way, answered the poor man. Well, you're not far wrong, for this is hell, said the old man. When you get inside, they will be all for buying your flitch, for meat is scarce in hell. But mind you don't sell it unless you get the hand quern, which stands behind the door for it. When you come out, I'll teach you how to handle the quern, for it's good to grind almost anything. So the man with the flitch thanked the other for his good advice, and gave a great knock at the devil's door. When he got in, everything went just as the old man had said. All the devils, great and small, came swarming up to him like ants round an ant-hill, and each tried to outbid the other for the flitch. Well, said the man, by rights my old dame and I ought to have this flitch for our Christmas dinner. But since you have all set your hearts on it, I suppose I must give it up to you. But if I sell it at all, I'll have for it that quern behind the door yonder. At first, the devil wouldn't hear of such a bargain, and chaffered and haggled with the man. But he stuck to what he said, and at last the devil had to part with his quern. When the man got out into the yard, he asked the old woodcutter how he was to handle the quern, and after he had learned how to use it, he thanked the old man, and went off home as fast as he could. But still, the clock had struck 12 on Christmas Eve before he reached his own door. "Wherever in the world have you been?" said his old dame. "Here have I sat, hour after hour, waiting and watching, without so much as 2 sticks to lay together under the Christmas brose." "Ah," said the man, "I couldn't get back before, for I had to go a long way first for one thing, and then for another, but now you shall see what you shall see." So he put the quern on the table, and bade it first of all grind lights, then a tablecloth, then meat, then ale, and so on till they had got everything that was nice for Christmas fare. He had only to speak the word, and the quern ground out what he wanted. The old dame stood by blessing her stars, and kept on asking where he had got this wonderful quern, but he wouldn't tell her. "It's all one where I got it from. You see the quern is a good one, and the mill stream never freezes. That's enough." So he ground meat and drink and dainties enough to last out till 12th day, and on the 3rd day he asked all his friends and kin to his house, and gave a great feast. Now, when his rich brother saw all that was on the table, and all that was behind in the larder, he grew quite spiteful and wild, for he couldn't bear that his brother should have anything. "'Twas only on Christmas Eve," he said to the rest. "He was in such straits that he came and asked for a morsel of food in God's name, and now he gives a feast as if he were count or king." And he turned to his brother and said, "But whence in hell's name have you got all this wealth?" "From behind the door," answered the owner of the quern, for he didn't care to let the cat out of the bag. But later on the evening, when he had got a drop too much, he could keep his secret no longer, and brought out the quern and said, "There, you see what has gotten me all this wealth." And so he made the quern grind all kind of things. When his brother saw it, he set his heart on having the quern, and, after a deal of coaxing, he got it. But he had to pay $300 for it, and his brother bargained to keep it till hay harvest, for he thought, if I keep it till then, I can make it grind meat and drink that will last for years. So you may fancy the quern didn't grow rusty for want of work, and when hay harvest came, the rich brother got it. But the other took care not to teach him how to handle it. It was evening when the rich brother got the quern home, and next morning he told his wife to go out into the hayfield and toss, while the mowers cut the grass, and he would stay at home and get the dinner ready. So when dinner time drew near, he put the quern on the kitchen table and said, "Grind herrings and broth, and grind them good and fast." So the quern began to grind herrings and broth. First of all the dishes full, then all the tubs full, and so on till the kitchen floor was quite covered. Then the man twisted and twirled at the quern to get it to stop, but for all his twisting and fingering, the quern went on grinding, and in a little while the broth rose so high that the man was like to drown. So he threw open the kitchen door and ran into the parlor, but it wasn't long before the quern had ground the parlor full too. And it was only at the risk of his life that the man could get hold of the latch of the house door through the stream of broth. When he got the door open, he ran out and set off down the road, with the stream of herrings and broth at his heels, roaring like a waterfall over the whole farm. Now, his old dame, who was in the field tossing hay, thought it a long time to dinner, and at last she said, "Well, though the master doesn't call us home, we may as well go. Maybe he finds it hard work to boil the broth, and will be glad of my help." The men were willing enough, so they sauntered homewards. But just as they had got a little way up the hill, what should they meet but herrings and broth and bread, all running and dashing and splashing together in a stream, and the master himself running before them for his life. And as he passed them, he bawled out, "Would to heaven each of you had 100 throats! But take care you're not drowned in the broth!" Away he went, as though the evil one were at his heels, to his brother's house, and begged him, for God's sake, to take back the quern that instant. "For," said he, "if it grinds 1 hour more, the whole parish will be swallowed up by herrings and broth." But his brother wouldn't hear of taking it back, till the other paid him down $300 more. So the poor brother got both the money and the quern, and it wasn't long before he set up a farmhouse far finer than the one in which his brother lived. And with the quern he ground so much gold that he covered it with plates of gold. And as the farm lay by the seaside, the golden house gleamed and glistened far away over the sea. All who sailed by put ashore to see the rich man in the golden house, and to see the wonderful quern, the fame of which spread far and wide, till there was nobody who hadn't heard tell of it. So one day there came a skipper who wanted to see the quern, and the first thing he asked was if it could grind salt. "Grind salt?" said the owner. "I should just think it could. It can grind anything." When the skipper heard that, he said he must have the quern, cost what it would, for if he only had it, he thought he should be rid of his long voyages across stormy seas for a lading of salt. Well, at first the man wouldn't hear of parting with the quern, but the skipper begged and prayed so hard that at last he let him have it. But he had to pay many, many $1,000s for it. Now, when the skipper had got the quern on his back, he soon made off with it, for he was afraid lest the man should change his mind. So he had no time to ask how to handle the quern, but got on board his ship as fast as he could and set sail. When he had sailed a good way off, he brought the quern on deck and said, "Grind salt, and grind both good and fast." Well, the quern began to grind salt, so that it poured out like water, and when the skipper had got the ship full, he wished to stop the quern, but whichever way he turned it, and however much he tried, it was no good. The quern kept grinding on, and the heap of salt grew higher and higher, and at last down sank the ship. There lies the quern at the bottom of the sea, and grinds away at this very day, and that's why the sea is salt. End of section 9. Recording by Brian von Diedenroth. www.brianvondedenroth.com.
Section 10 of Popular Tales from the Norse. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ted Nugent. Popular Tales from the Norse by Sir George Webbe Dasent. Section 10. The Old Dame and Her Hen. Once upon a time there was an old widow who lived far away from the rest of the world, up under a hillside with her 3 daughters. She was so poor that she had no stock but one single hen, which she prized as the apple of her eye. In short, it was always cackling at her heels, and she was always running to look after it. Well, one day, all at once, the hen was missing, and the old wife went out and round the cottage, looking and calling for her hen, but it was gone, and there was no getting it back. So the woman said to her eldest daughter, "You must just go out and see if you can find our hen, for have it back we must, even if we have to fetch it out of the hill." Well, the daughter was ready enough to go, so she set off and walked up and down, and looked and called, but no hen could she find. But all at once, just as she was about to give up the hunt, she heard someone calling out in a cleft in the rock, "Your hen trips inside the hill, your hen trips inside the hill." So she went into the cleft to see what it was, but she had scarce set her foot inside the cleft before she fell through a trapdoor, deep down into a vault underground. When she got to the bottom, she went through many rooms, each finer than the other, but in the innermost room of all, a great ugly man of the hill folk came up to her and asked, "Will you be my sweetheart?" "No, I will not," she said. She wouldn't have him at any price, not she. All she wanted was to get the bow ground again as fast as ever she could, and to look after her hen which was lost. Then the man of the hill got so angry that he took her up and wrung her head off, and threw both the head and trunk down into the cellar. While this was going on, her mother sat at home waiting and waiting, but no daughter came. So after she had waited a bit longer, and neither heard nor saw anything of her daughter, she said to her midmost daughter that she must go out and see after her sister, and she added, "You can just give our hen a call at the same time." Well, the second sister had to get off, and the very same thing befell her. She went about looking and calling, and all at once she too heard a voice away in the cleft of the rock, saying, "Your hen trips inside the hill, your hen trips inside the hill." She thought this strange, and went to see what it could be, and so she too fell through the trapdoor, deep down into the vault. There she went from room to room, and in the innermost one, the man of the hill came to her and asked if she would be his sweetheart. No, that she wouldn't. All she wanted was to get above ground again and hunt for her hen which was lost. So the man of the hill got so angry and took her up and wrung her head off, and threw both head and trunk down into the cellar. Now the old dame had sat and waited 7 lengths and 7 breadths for her second daughter, and could neither see nor hear anything of her. She said to the youngest, "Now you really must set off and see after your sisters. 'Twas silly to lose the hen, but 'twill be sillier still if you lose both your sisters, and you can give the hen a call at the same time." For the old dame's heart was still set on her hen. Yes, the youngest was ready enough to go, so she walked up and down, wanting for her sisters and calling the hen, but she could neither see nor hear anything of them. So at last she too came up to the cleft in the rock, and heard how something said, "Your hen trips inside the hill, your hen trips inside the hill." She thought this strange, so she too went to see what it was, and found through the trapdoor too, deep, deep down into a vault. When she reached the bottom, she went from one room to another, each grander than the other, but she wasn't at all afraid, and took good time to look about her. So, as she was peeping into this and that, she cast her eye on the trapdoor into the cellar, and looked down it, and what should she see there but her sisters, who lay dead. She had scarce time to slam the trapdoor before the man of the hill came to her and asked, "Will you be my sweetheart?" "With all my heart," answered the girl, for she saw very well how it had gone with her sisters. So, when the man of the hill heard that, she got her the finest clothes in the world. She had only asked for them, or for anything else she had a mind to, and she got what she wanted. So glad was the man of the hill that anyone would be his sweetheart. But when she had been there a little while, she was one day even more doleful and downcast than was her wont. So the man of the hill asked her what was the matter, and why she was in such dumps. "Ah," said the girl, "it's because I can't get home to my mother. She's hard-pinched, I know, for meat and drink, and has no one with her." "Well," said the man of the hill, "I can't let you go to see her, but just stuff some meat and drink into a sack, and I will carry it to her." Yes, she would do so, she said, with many thanks. But at the bottom of the sack she stuffed a lot of gold and silver, and afterwards she laid a little food on the top of the gold and silver. Then she told the ogre the sack was ready, but he must be sure not to look into it. So he gave his word he wouldn't, and set off. Now, as the man of the hill walked off, she peeped out after him through a chink in the trapdoor, but when he had gone a bit on the way, he said, "This sack is so heavy, I will just see what there is inside it." And so he was about to untie the mouth of the sack, but the girl called out to him, "I see what you are at, I see what you are at." "The deuce you do," said the man of the hill. "Then you must have plaguey sharp eyes in your head, that's all." So he threw the sack over his shoulder, and dared not try to look into it again. When he reached the widow's cottage, he threw the sack in through the cottage door, and said, "Here you have meat and drink from your daughter. She doesn't want for nothing." So when the girl had been in the hill a good bit longer, one day a billy goat fell down the trapdoor. "Who sent for you, I should like to know, you long-bearded beast?" said the man of the hill, who was in an awful rage, and with that he whipped up the goat and wrung his head off and threw him down into the cellar. "Oh," said the girl, "why did you do that? I might have had the goat to play with down here." "Well," said the man of the hill, "you needn't be so down in the mouth about it, I should think, for I can soon put life into the billy goat again." So saying, he took a flask which hung up against the wall, put the billy goat's head on his body again, and smeared it with some ointment out of the flask, and he was as well and as lively as ever again. "Ho, ho," said the girl to herself, "that flask is worth something, that it is." So when she had been some time longer in the hill, she watched for a day when the man of the hill was away, took her eldest sister, and putting her head on her shoulders, smeared her with some of the ointment out of the flask, just as she had seen the man of the hill do with the billy goat, and in a trice her sister came to life again. Then the girl stuffed her into a sack, laid a little food over her, and as soon as the man of the hill came home, she said to him, "Dear friend, now do go home to my mother with a morsel of food again. Poor thing, she's both hungry and thirsty, I'll be bound, and besides that, she's all alone in the world. But you must mind not to look into the sack." Well, he said he would carry the sack, and he said too that he would not look into it. But when he had gone a little way, he thought the sack got awfully heavy, and when he had gone a bit further, he said to himself, "Come what will, I must see what's inside this sack, for however sharp her eyes may be, she can't see me all this way off." But just as she was about to untie the sack, the girl who sat inside the sack called out, "I see what you are at! I see what you are at!" "The deuce you do," said the ogre. "Then you must have plaguey sharp eyes." For he thought all the while it was the girl inside the hill who was speaking. So he didn't care so much as to peep into the sack again, but carried it straight to her mother as fast as he could, and when he got to the cottage door, he threw it in through the door, and bawled out, "Here you have meat and drink from your daughter. She wants for nothing." When the girl had been in the hill a while longer, she did the very same thing with her other sister. She put her head on her shoulders, smeared her with ointment out of the flask, brought her to life, and stuffed her into the sack. But this time she crammed in also as much gold and silver as the sack would hold, and over all laid a very little food. "Dear friend," she said to the man of the hill, "you really must run home to my mother with a little food again, and mind you don't look into the sack." Yes, the man of the hill was ready enough to do as she wished, and he gave his word too that he wouldn't look into the sack. But when he had gone a bit of the way, he began to think the sack got awfully heavy, and when he had gone a bit further, he could scarce stagger along under it. So he set it down, and was just about to untie the string and look into it, when the girl inside the sack bawled out, "I see what you are at! I see what you are at!" "The deuce you do!" said the man of the hill. "Then you must have plaguey sharp eyes of your own." Well, He dared not try to look into the sack, but made all the haste he could, and carried the sack straight to the girl's mother. When he got to the cottage door, he threw the sack in through the door and roared down, "Here you have food from your daughter. She wants for nothing." So when the girl had been there a good while longer, the man of the hill made up his mind to go out for the day. Then the girl shamed to be sick and sorry, and pouted and fretted. "It's no use you coming home before 12 o'clock at night," she said, "for I shan't be able to have supper ready before. I am so sick and poorly." But when the man of the hill was well out of the house, she stuffed some of her clothes with straw, and stuck up this less of straw in the corner by the chimney, with a besom in her hand, so that it looked just as if she herself was standing there. After that she stole off home, and got a sharpshooter to stay in the cottage with her mother. So when the clock struck 12, or just about it, home came the man of the hill, and the first thing he said to the straw girl was, "Give me something to eat." But she answered him never a word. "Give me something to eat, I say," called out the man of the hill, "for I am almost starved." No, she hadn't a word to throw at him. "Give me something to eat," roared down the ogre the third time. "I think you'd better open your eyes and hear what I say, or else I will wake you up, that I will." No, the girl stood just as still as ever, so he flew into a rage, and gave her such a slap in the face that the straw flew all about the room. But when he saw that, he knew he had been tricked, and began to hunt everywhere, and at last, when he came to the cellar, and found both the girl sisters missing, he soon saw how the cat jumped, and ran off to the cottage, saying, "I will soon pay her off." But when he reached the cottage, the sharpshooter fired off his piece, and then the man of the hill dared not got into the house, for he thought it was thunder. So he set off home again as fast as he could lay legs to the ground. But what do you think? Just as he got to the trapdoor, the sun rose, and the man of the hill burst. Oh, if one only knew where the trapdoor was, I'll be bound there's a whole heap of gold and silver down there still. End of section 10.